This guide covers all the actions the summoner learns from level 51 to 90, including how each action is meant to be used and recommendations when necessary. We also go over the rotation at level 60, 70 and 80. The guide finishes with a level 90 specific guide covering opener, rotation, 2-minute bursts and stat priorities. I will assume you already know how to play summon at level 50, and if not, then I recommend my starter guide for this information. I will also assume you are acquainted with common abbreviations like GCD, OGCD and weaving, and in case you need a refresher, I have shorts on both of these subjects. Now then, at level 52, you learn the ability Energy Siphon, which is an AoE alternative to Energy Drain, which beats it with 3 or more targets. Notably, Energy Siphon is equal to Energy Drain when there are 2 targets. At level 54, Rune 2 is permanently upgraded to Rune 3, and this also upgrades Ruby, Topaz and Emerald Rune 2 to their Rune 3 counterparts, increasing the damage of all 4 spells slightly. This makes Emerald and Topaz Rune identical in power, and Ruby Rune stays at the top, still doing more damage per second than regular Rune without the help of auto attacks. As such, this does not really change your actual rotation. At level 58, Ether Charge permanently upgrades to Dreadwyrm Trance, which, while active, replaces Rune 3 and Outburst with Astral Impulse and Astral Flare respectively. These 2 spells are instant and do way more damage than Rune and Outburst. Use Astral Impulse on 1 or 2 targets and Astral Flare on 3 or more targets, and these, of course, take priority over everything else until the trance ends. Because of them being instant, you should be able to fit 6 casts within the trance with a small amount of spell speed. At level 60, you learn the spell Astral Flow, which does not actually do anything on its own, and simply changes into other spells and abilities that actually do something in certain situations. For now, when you enter Dreadwyrm Trance, Astral Flow changes into Death Flare, an ability that does a huge amount of damage, with some of the damage being AoE. The cooldown of Death Flare means that you only get to cast Death Flare once per Dreadwyrm Trance, and obviously you should use Death Flare in every Dreadwyrm Trance. Since level 50, you have learned Energy Siphon as an AoE alternative to Energy Drain, and all of your runes have been upgraded. Ether Charge was replaced with Dreadwyrm Trance, and Astral Flow further intensifies this trance state. As Energy Drain has a cooldown of 1 minute and Death Flare will always be available once per Dreadwyrm Trance, you should prioritize Energy Drain over Death Flare if you're ever put in the situation of having to choose. For your opener, start by pre-casting Rune 3 as the tank pulls, and then use Dreadwyrm Trance, weaving Energy Drain and Death Flare. Then repeatedly cast Astral Impulse and weave 1 Fester after each cast. Once Dreadwyrm Trance runs out, work your way through the summons. Remember, Ifrit and its Ruby runes have the highest damage potential at this level. At level 62, Energy Drain and Energy Siphon are upgraded to also grant the Further Ruin buff for 1 minute, essentially 1 per Energy Drain. To spend Further Ruin, you also learn the spell Rune 4, which, weirdly, is not an upgrade of Rune 3. As Rune 4 can only be used once per Energy Drain, and you have a full minute to choose when to use it, you should not be in a rush to spend it. Make sure to spend it outside of Dreadwyrm Trance, but aside from this, you can use it whenever it happens to be convenient. 2 notable times to consider using Rune 4 is either if you suddenly need extra mobility, like if you're in the middle of the Ifrit part of your rotation, or you are completely out of attunements altogether and waiting for Dreadwyrm Trance. Alternatively, Rune 4 also has an AoE component, and it is very beneficial to cast it when there are multiple targets, since its damage even on 1 target is impressive. If neither AoE or mobility reasons come up, simply casting Rune 4 once you're out of Trance, Arcanums and Attunements is also perfectly fine. Just make sure to spend Rune 4 before you lose it. At level 66, you learn the ability Searing Light, which boosts you and your party's damage by 3% for 30 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. This should be used on cooldown whenever possible. Weave it before Energy Drain, but after Dreadwyrm Trance is cast in your opener, and delay Death Flare 1 GCD later to make space for it. As Ifrit's Ruby Ruins are your strongest options after Dreadwyrm Trance, it is even more beneficial at this level to prioritize it while you benefit from this damage bonus. With the introduction of Searing Light, it is also beneficial to only spend Ether Flow on Fester and Pain Flare during Searing Light. This means that every 2 minutes, you can use 2 Festers, Energy Drain and another 2 Festers to gain slightly more damage during this buff. At level 70, Dreadwyrm Trance is permanently upgraded to summon Bahamut, which, on top of Dreadwyrm Trance's existing effects, summons Bahamut to your side for the duration of the trance. This also means that Carbuncle is not present to cast Radiant Aegis for 15 seconds. While Bahamut is present, he will cast Wormwave 4 times on your target, assuming he has time to do so. You also learn the ability Enkindle Bahamut, which orders Bahamut to cast Achmorn on your target, which does a monstrous amount of damage with an AoE component. Like Death Flare, you have time to cast Enkindle Bahamut once per trance, and as such, you should prioritize it like Death Flare, after Energy Drain. Naturally, both Death Flare and Enkindle Bahamut should be prioritized a lot higher if the trance is about to run out. As summons like Bahamut are quite large, it is worth mentioning that there are game commands to choose how large summons appear for you. This changes the size of summons from your perspective and doesn't affect other players. This particular command will set the size of all summons to the smallest they can be. Since level 60, you gained access to Ruin 4 as an extra attack to use for some extra AoE burst, or extra mobility, or simply as a better filler than Ruin 3, once per minute. You also got Searing Light for a raid cooldown, and of course, Bahamut now joins you for your Dreadwyrm trances. Searing Light being present also means that stockpiling ether flow outside of the buff, and using all of it during the buff, can be done for slightly more damage output. This changes your opener very slightly. Precast Ruin 3 as the tank is pulling, then cast Summon Bahamut and weave Searing Light and Energy Drain. Then cast Astral Impulse, weaving Enkindle Bahamut and Fester. Another Astral Impulse, weaving Death Flare and Fester. And then simply spam Astral Impulse until the trance ends. Then make your way through the summons. I recommend saving Ruin 4 for either unexpected necessary movement during Ifrit, or until you have spent all of your Arcanums and Attunements and are just waiting for the next Bahamut. At level 72, Ruby, Topaz and Emerald Ruin 3 are all replaced with Ruby, Topaz and Emerald Right, increasing their potency significantly. As Ruby Right and Emerald Right are significantly bigger upgrades than Topaz Right, this means Ifrit is still the strongest, then Garuda is second and then Titan last. Notably, Ruby Outburst is equal to Ruby Right on 3 targets, and Emerald Outburst only beats Emerald Right on 4 or more targets. However, these details are not super crucially important to keep track of, as at level 74, Outburst is permanently upgraded to Tri-Disaster, and this also upgrades Ruby, Topaz and Emerald Outburst to their Disaster counterparts, increasing the damage of all 4 spells slightly. This once again means that Tri-Disaster and its Ruby, Topaz and Emerald versions are stronger than Ruin and the Rights on 3 or more targets. At level 80, you learn the spell Summon Phoenix, which replaces Summon Bahamut on every second cast. When you use Summon Phoenix, Enkindle Bahamut is replaced with Enkindle Phoenix, which does literally the same thing, instead casting Revelation for the exact same damage. Phoenix will also cast Scarlet Flame instead of Wormwave 4 times in its duration. When summoned, Phoenix also casts Everlasting Flight, applying a significant heal over time effect to your party. In place of Death Flare, Astral Flow instead turns into Rekindle, which is a decent heal that applies a buff to the target. If the target falls under half HP, or the effect runs out, it turns into a surprisingly strong heal over time effect. You should find time to use Rekindle in every Firebird trance, even if you just use it on yourself. Most of the time, it is beneficial to your raid to use it on someone other than yourself. In fact, if you have no reason to use it on yourself, your default action should be to target the tank and pass the effect to them. Your tanks and healers will appreciate it. Finally, Ruin 3 and Tri-Disaster turns into Fountain of Fire and Brand of Purgatory respectively, which are alternative versions of Astral Impulse and Astral Flare that do even more damage per cast. Notably, this causes Phoenix to have more AoE damage potential than Bahamut, but otherwise the increased damage of these spells only make them very slightly better due to the lack of Death Flare. Since level 70, not very much has changed about your rotation, aside from some potency increases, the only notable changes being Phoenix and Rekindle. This means that your opener and rotation is completely unchanged from the level 70 version. You can choose to prioritize Rekindle like Death Flare, however, as the ability is supportive, the only thing you need to worry about is getting Rekindle used at all before Firebird Trance ends. At level 82, Ruby, Topaz and Emerald Disaster are replaced with Ruby, Topaz and Emerald Catastrophe, slightly increasing their damage. This does not change your rotation at all. At level 84, you learn the trait Ruin Mastery 4, increasing the potency of Ruin 3 and your 3 rights. This also does not change your rotation. At level 86, you learn the trait Elemental Mastery, which unlocks the Astral Flow mechanic for Ifrit, Titan and Garuda. When you summon Ifrit, you gain the Ifrit's favor buff, turning Astral Flow into Crimson Cyclone, which is a spell that dashes you to your target and strikes them in melee range. It also does some AoE damage. It then turns into Crimson Strike, which is a combo spell that strikes the target again, also with an AoE component. Even attempting to cast anything else will cancel this combo. Make sure to use both of these attacks back to back before moving on to the next primal. Note that while Ifrit's favor does not have a duration, you can keep it as long as you like, summoning anything else will remove the effect. When you summon Garuda, you gain the Garuda's favor buff, turning Astral Flow into Slipstream, a spell with a long cast time and even longer recast time that does damage with an AoE component and places an area of effect that deals additional damage in the area for 15 seconds afterwards. Note that the placement of this area is based on where the target was when you started casting, not where they are when you finish casting. For some reason. Due to the very long cast time of Slipstream, it is often recommended to at least consider using Swiftcast for it, just like with Ruby Rite. Just like with Ifrit's favor, you have until you summon something else to use Slipstream. Whenever you use Topaz Rite or Topaz Catastrophe, you gain the Titan's favor buff, which turns Astral Flow into Mountain Buster, which is an ability that is intended to be weaved immediately after Topaz Rite. Mountain Buster does decent damage with an AoE component, and just like the other favors, is kept until you summon something else. Naturally, as each Topaz Rite cast grants this favor, it is important to spend it immediately to make space for a new one. With the introduction of Elemental Mastery, Titan is by a significant margin considered the strongest of the primals, with Garuda being second and Ifrit being the weakest. Of course, still worth using though. Take note that using all the trance attacks you can, all of the elemental mastery actions, spending all of the attunements and summon casts, and Ruin 4 leaves just 1 GCD per minute for filler, which of course will be Ruin 3. This makes it crucially important to plan when you use casted spells like Ruby Rite and Slipstream, and melee attacks like Crimson Cyclone and Crimson Strike, so you don't delay. Also for this reason, it is also significantly less crucial to spend all of your attunements before summoning Bahamut or Phoenix, and in fact, outside of heavy optimization, summoning Bahamut or Phoenix on cooldown is almost always optimal over spending all of the Arcanums, if you get delayed for some reason. At level 88, your Radiant Aegis gets an extra charge. This does mean you can be much more free with your use of this shield, since you can always have an extra one. Remember that if you need a shield in 15 seconds, but Bahamut is coming up in 3, then you won't have Carbuncle to cast it in time. In these situations, using Radiant Aegis early can be convenient. For learning new fights, using Radiant Aegis whenever you have 2 charges anyway can be beneficial to protect you from unexpected attacks. At level 90, summon Ifrit, Titan and Garuda are permanently upgraded to summon Ifrit, Titan and Garuda 2, which increases their damage somewhat and replaces them with actual Ifrit, Titan and Garuda instead of Aegis, or Carbuncles if you chose to use them. All 3 now also apply their damage in an area around the target instead of their wonky areas based on their locations. However, this does not change your rotation at all. To round off, let's first talk about an opener, followed by general rotation, as well as how this works with the 2-minute burst. And finally, let's briefly touch on stat priorities on gear. Let's begin. Make sure your Carbuncle is summoned, then 1.5 seconds before combat starts, cast Ruin. Then summon Bahamut and late weave Searing Light. Cast Astral Impulse, and if you intend to use a tincture, a so-called burst potion, this is the time. Then cast Astral Impulse 2 more times, and then weave Energy Drain and enkindle Bahamut. Another Astral Impulse, weaving Death Flare and Fester. One more Astral Impulse weaving Fester, and then one final Astral Impulse. Then summon Titan and alternate between Topaz Rite and Mountain Buster until all stacks are spent. Then summon Garuda and weave Swiftcast and finish with Slipstream. If you are in a coordinated raid, and it includes a lot of jobs with shorter raid buffs like Bard, Monk, Reaper, Astrologian or Dragoon, you can gain slightly more damage by jumping straight to Garuda and Slipstream after Bahamut and using Titan later in the rotation. This then leads to the general rotation. The summoner rotation simply revolves around going into Trance, making use of the Trance exclusive attacks, and then going through each primal summon and its tools and resources to pass the time, including 1 Ruin 4 and Energy Drain in each minute-long set. A few particular steps to optimize around is that Ifrit's toolkit is very strict in positioning, as half of it requires you to go into melee range and the other half has really long cast times. So planning when you use Ifrit specifically so it doesn't get messed up by boss mechanics can be incredibly helpful for your damage output. Another step is that if you don't have any raid buffs, like after Phoenix usually, then swift casting Slipstream is not going to increase your damage output, so saving this cast for either Resurrection or maybe making the Ifrit part of the rotation a bit easier can be helpful too. As the Phoenix section of your rotation typically falls outside of raid buffs, you can completely skip casting Fester during this part and saving them for raid buffs later. This of course means that the 2-minute burst starts with summon Bahamut alongside Searing Light somewhere, then casting Festers alongside Death Flare and Enkindle, followed by Energy Drain and more Festers. Naturally, your 2-minute burst will, aside from those 2 extra festers and perhaps a slightly differently placed Searing Light, be exactly the same as your opener. For AoE adjustments, Ruin, Rites, Energy Drain and Fester are replaced with Tri-Disaster, Catastrophes, Energy Siphon and Pain Flare when there are 3 or more targets. Astral Flows and Enkindles are used the same way as on single target. Finally, regarding stat priorities, take note that in nearly every single case, item level beats out optimal secondary stats. This means you should always prioritize gear with higher item level as long as it has intelligence on it. After that, Summoner's stat priority is spell speed until you have a GCD of at least 2.48. If you can't fit 6 Astral Impulse casts in Summon Bahamut, get more spell speed until you can. A GCD of 2.45 is considered a comfort build that makes this a lot easier. After that, your priority is critical hit and then determination and direct hit. Determination and direct hit are almost identical in value, with determination being a tiny bit better, so given the choice between the two, it should be preferred. Summoner is also capable of working with a heavy spell speed build, which instead prioritizes spell speed over everything else, and then determination and direct hit, preferring to not bother with critical hit at all. The downsides of this build is that it is very likely to drift your trances out of Searing Light, and will also make energy drain fall much more awkwardly over time. This is however very beneficial if you also like to play Black Mage a lot, as this means both jobs can share gear more easily. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, while Akmon and Revelation share the first place for highest potency attack in the game with Ninja's Hyosho Ranryu, a combination of factors being a mandatory damage bonus from Kasatsu for Ninja, as well as pets just doing less damage than players, Akmon and Revelation will do closer to 80% of the damage of Hyosho Ranryu, despite them having the exact same listed potencies.